Well, hello, everybody. Apologies for the slight delay in getting started. We had a little trouble with our webinar program, but please welcome everyone. I'm so pleased that you're here. I'm Carolyn Eastman. I'm a member of the faculty in American history at VCU's history department, and I'm very pleased to welcome you to this, the 11th annual lecture on the history of the American Revolutionary Era. This lecture is sponsored by the Society of the Cincinnati in the state of Virginia. Every year, the Society's generosity allows us to invite a scholar whose work on the Revolutionary Era has the potential to shift our thinking, and this year is no exception. And I want to give special thanks to the Society because, as we all know, our university is currently facing even more tough economic times than we usually are, such that many of the special events that make college life so rich and meaningful have been defunded. But thanks to the Society of the Cincinnati and the state of Virginia, not this one. We are so grateful for the Society's generosity. And in fact, we're currently recording this lecture so that we hope even more people can attend than usual than when we have a regular in-person event. So this is the 9th lecture that I've helped to organize. And I can honestly say that I never thought I'd have a scholar of Russian history delivering one of these talks. But my surprise and delight upon learning about this subject, I think, is a testament to the significance of what George Munro is going to discuss today. Scholars of the American Revolution rarely make more than a passing reference to Russia. But what George has done with this book suggests that that will change. So Dr. George Munro is my beloved colleague at VCU and is a renowned scholar of 18th century Russia. At VCU, he served as the chair of our department and was awarded VCU's Distinguished Faculty Service Award. He also was recognized by the Southern Conference on Slavic Studies with its Lifetime Service Award. He's a graduate of the doctoral program in history at UNC Chapel Hill and is the author of many articles and books, most recently the book, The Most Intentional City, St. Petersburg in the Reign of Catherine the Great. He has served as a Fulbright Scholar to Russia 3 times, most recently researching the history of a small city in the far north. One of his many books is a documents collection on Catherine the Great that he edited with the scholar David M. Griffiths. And in fact, he was so close with Griffiths that when Griffiths died in 2014, having not quite completed a fascinating but unwieldy manuscript, George took on the editing of it for publication with Slavica Publishers. So George's talk today emerges from that groundbreaking research that has just appeared in the book that is delightfully titled No Collusion, Catherine the Great and American Independence. Now, before we get started, I wanted to alert everyone to the fact that upon conclusion of this talk, George will be answering questions. So if you look to the bottom of your screen and you click on the Q&A icon, you can type in your question and we'll get to them in order. I'll read those questions aloud at the end of the talk. So with that, I can't tell you how pleased I am to welcome Dr. George Munro for this year's Society of the Cincinnati lecture, and I'll turn things over to him.
Thank you very much, Carolyn, for that kind introduction. Yes, it is sort of odd to have a Russian historian talking about the American Revolutionary War, but I think you'll see why it is appropriate as we move on into it. The book really does come out of the research of David Griffiths. David came to the University of North Carolina when I was almost through with my PhD. But the person that I had studied with left and went to another university, and David ended up being the person who signed my dissertation, even though I never studied with him. In later years, he and I did a number of things together. Here you see 2 books that we translated. One is Some of the Laws of Catherine, or we did that one. He did the other one by himself, The Russian Empire in the 18th Century. I wasn't involved in that one. And several years ago, a number of his leading chapters from books and articles from journals appeared in Russian translation. It came out shortly before David died. I was able to give him a copy of the book, show it to him several months before he passed. So I was really happy about that. And now his other book, the really big one that he worked on for so many years, is finally coming out, No Collusion. In fact, I got the very first copies today. Here it is, the first one, hot off the press. I can hardly touch it. And people who attend this lecture today, you have a special chance to get a copy of your own copy of the book at a 30% discount from the publisher. I've got here on the bottom of this screen, and I'll have it again on the very last screen at the end of the lecture, the email or the web address that you can send to, or if that doesn't work or that's not convenient for you, there's the 1-877, that's a toll-free number, and then the 7 digits, SLAVICA. It's 30% off, and the shipping is free as well. So again, I'll say something about that at the very end. So in the 18th century, Russia really rose to an important position among European states. Many European states hardly accepted Russia as even being European until the time of Peter the Great. But Peter the Great, in the first quarter of the 18th century, placed Russia pretty firmly on the map with his victory over Sweden in the Great Northern War. And then under his successors, Russia continued to move up in the rank of countries until by the time of Catherine the Great, it was pretty much accepted as one of the major 4 or 5 countries in Europe. So that was a very quick rise on the part of Russia during that century. And that's a good bit of what's in David's book. We're going to be focusing on the portion of it, of course, that has to do with the United States. In 1763, shortly after Catherine came to the throne, this is pretty much what the European map looked like. Russia, of course, by far the biggest country in Europe, the Russian Empire. Seconded in size is Poland, Lithuania. Then you also have a very large German empire, the Holy Roman Empire, so-called. But as Voltaire reminded us, it wasn't holy, it wasn't Roman, and it wasn't really an empire. Far more important were the lands that were personally controlled by the Habsburgs, and the parts of the Netherlands controlled by the Austrian Habsburgs, Austria itself, and the Kingdom of Hungary had the Austrians there in the person of Maria Theresa during this period of time. But when Catherine came to the throne, she had to decide what her principal orientation was going to be in foreign affairs. Russia, since 1729, had been pretty closely aligned with Austria because both of them were attacking or being attacked by the Ottoman Empire here down in the far south. Both Russia and Austria-Hungary were at war from time to time. The Ottomans had been in Vienna practically, or just outside Vienna in 1683, that recently, and then shortly after that, of course, they've been thrown way back by the Habsburgs, and most of Hungary came back under Habsburg control. But Catherine decided that she was going to go with a northern policy. Her husband, whom she overthrew, had been very much in favor of Prussia, Prussia being the blue state, not entirely connected. You've got the biggest chunk of it. This is Brandenburg. Then they had picked up territories in the west, and they had picked up East Prussia here. But these 2 largest chunks were separated by a good bit of Poland, Lithuania. Catherine went with the plans of Nikita Ivanovich Panin. Panin was maybe Russia's best-known diplomat during this period of time. He had spent much of his adult life in either Denmark or Sweden. He was ambassador to both of those places. And he was fully committed to Russia playing a role in the north of Europe, in the Baltic Sea in particular. And his dream was to create the so-called Northern System, the Northern System, which would consist of a number of allied countries in the north, Poland, Lithuania would be a part of it. Sweden would be a part of it, and of course Finland as a part of Sweden. Denmark would be in it. Prussia would be in it. Norway, still a part of Denmark at that time. And possibly even Great Britain, because Great Britain and Russia had proven in the past to have a pretty good friendship, which I'll talk about. Well, Catherine, in the first 15 or so, 17 years of her reign, as I say here, she proves her chops. In foreign policy, Catherine became one of the people who added significantly to Russian territory. The first addition of land that she made came in the first partition of Poland, which was a very complicated issue, had a complicated history. Catherine had basically picked the king of Poland in 1764, and a number of Poles refused to go along with it and began to oppose it militarily, and so the Russian army had units in southern Poland in particular. And in trying to chase some of these Poles who had formed a confederation and capture them, the Russian units chased them into Turkish territory, whereupon in 1768, the Sultan of Turkey declared war on Russia. And so the first Russian-Turkish war in Catherine's reign took place starting in 1768. In the midst of that war, as the Russian army was proving to be quite successful, taking the Crimea militarily, going into what is today Romania militarily, Frederick II intervened, and he suggested to Catherine that winning this war, and you will win the war, it was going to take the Turks some years until 1774 finally to agree on the peace treaty, but you will win the war, but you should not take territory from Turkey because that will set up too many other countries. Too many other countries have interests there. You need to reward yourself, and the best place to reward yourself is probably from Poland. And since I'm the broker in all of this, maybe I should get a nice little slice for myself. And what he wanted to pick up was that patch of land in between his two main domains. And of course, to keep the Austrians happy, we have to cut them into the deal as well. And so you see in the first partition, Russia gets this, Prussia picks up this, and Austria gets this. So in terms of territory, Prussia's was most important because it combined together Frederick's two territories. And you may recall what Frederick said of Maria Theresa. Her Jesuit advisors had told her that this was a wrong thing to do, and Frederick said the more she wept, the more she took. Austria ended up getting a nice slice. And then the other thing, of course, the partition, which was done in 1772, a done deed in 1772. And then by 1774, Catherine's war with Turkey came to an end. And what Catherine insisted on in the treaty was that all of this area, which had been semi-autonomous and partly connected with the Ottoman Turks, this was the Crimean Khanate, a successor state of the great Mongolian Empire, the last one. The Crimean Khanate should become independent, although she saw this only as a partway stage towards eventually incorporating it into the Russian Empire. And so this area on the north coast of the Black Sea that you can see with the stripes, all of this becomes independent territory, not just the Crimea itself. And of course, all of this is happening in Europe. Catherine's proving her chops, and then things are not going well in North America. 1775, after a decade or so of disagreements, Stamp Act and Townsend Acts and a number of other things, you have the open conflict and the battles of Lexington and Concord, these little neighboring towns outside Boston on the 19th of April, 1775. And so now the 13 colonies, out of all the colonies Britain had in North America, those 13 begin now to press for independence. Britain would prefer not to use its own army. They didn't have that great an army. They were really good at Navy stuff, but their army was not all that great, and they had not done all that well on land in the 18th century, except in the colonial world, but not in Europe. But the British decided that they would hire troops. They would bring in mercenaries from some other states. And they thought the most suitable target would be Russia. The reason for this is Russia had built up a huge army. They had 250,000 men, maybe under arms, and Russia's war was now over. It had ended in 1774, so Catherine was going to have to find some way to support this enormous army, because when men were drafted into the army in Russia, when they were levied into the army, they served for life. The enlisted men did, and this was going to be expensive. So why not rent 20,000 of them or 25,000 of them to come over to North America? And Catherine toyed with the idea for some period of time of renting out part of her army to the British. Why would the British be particularly interested in Russia? Well, they had commercial contacts going back some period of time. In fact, they go back to the late 1500s. But in 1734, a commercial treaty had been signed between the two countries, extremely advantageous to the British. It had expired well before the 1760s, and the two countries had not renewed it, but there had been discussion about renewing it, and it was finally renewed in 1766. Catherine believed that Russia and Britain were natural allies, and the reason for this is that they were not contiguous. They had differing interests. They could trade in different kinds of goods, and so they were, in a sense, natural allies. Russia's war with Turkey is over. You got the large army, and so there were rumors for several months in North America that the Russians are coming. These rumors were printed in newspaper after newspaper, from Boston to Virginia, every place in between, all sorts of speculation: 20,000, 18,000, 40,000, 25,000 Russian troops are coming on various ships, maybe with troops from other countries as well. But Catherine finally said no, and it took a while for the rumors to die out, but the rumors eventually did die out, that the Russians are not coming. They are not going to send Russian troops in order to help Britain fight its war in order to keep its colonies. Well, if we think about what the 13 colonies knew about Russia, this is an intentionally blank slide because they knew almost nothing about Russia. There was no way to know anything about Russia. Very little had been published. What had been published was largely based on British sources that went back again to the 1500s and 1600s, and largely were not true. You talk about fake news, there was a lot of that. What was the understanding of Russia was largely incorrect, but there was very little understanding at all. And hardly any Russians had even come to the colonies by this time. There was an English diplomat at the end of the 1500s who had called Russia a rude and barbarous kingdom, and this pretty much was how Englishmen and Englishwomen and how people in North America still looked at Russia. One of the few who had come was a man named Fyodor Korzhavin. He was here at the end of the 60s and in the early 70s. He traveled up and down the East Coast of the 13 colonies. He got to know quite a few people. He spent a good bit of time in Williamsburg, by the way. And later on, after he went back to Russia, he went back before the war started. But when he went back to Russia, somebody noticed that the Great Seal of the College of William and Mary was no longer where it should be, and he was accused of having stolen it. There was no evidence, but the accusation was made that Fyodor Korzhavin had stolen it. Years and years and years later, a professor of Russian history at the College of William and Mary, when he was in Russia doing research, he tried to investigate this question. Did anybody in Russia or did any archives in Russia have anything at all, any knowledge at all about the Great Seal of the College of William and Mary? And it turns out no. It was probably some good, honest American who stole it, or it just disappeared. It was not Fyodor Korzhavin. But the colonists knew very little about Russia, and of course Russians knew very little about the colonies. But the Battle of Saratoga, two battles actually, in September and October of 1777, when General Burgoyne was finally defeated by Horatio Gates. This was the one great victory that the 13 colonies had had, and they wanted to parlay that victory into getting some badly needed help. because it was fairly clear these 13 colonies, if Great Britain decided to throw everything at them, would not really be able to defeat Great Britain. They needed some help from the continent. And France, of course, was the place to go. And by early 1778, just a few months later, Benjamin Franklin persuaded the new king, Louis XVI, to give assistance to the colonies. A treaty was signed in February of 1778, by which France, hoping to gain back some of what it had lost to Britain in the 7 Years' War, all of Canada, slaving stations in West Africa, colonies in India, and elsewhere around the world, in the Caribbean and other places, hoping to get all of that back. But the French were a problem because a lot of Americans were persuaded that France, of course, is going to do things only to its own benefit. And they weren't sure they wanted to swap a British for a French master. The fears were particularly strong in Great Britain. I think not as strong in the southern colony, in New England, not as strong in the southern colonies, but a number of the New Englanders were really worried about the role that the French might play, particularly if the French played a really important role in helping to bring about independence for the 13 colonies. The Virginians weren't quite as concerned about that. The middle colonies weren't that concerned. Franklin, after all, spent a number of years in France. Jefferson, very much pro-France and spoke French. But it's in the New Englanders that you find much more hesitancy to play along with that. Meanwhile, in France, the new king strongly reversed French policy. French foreign policy had been controlled by the Duc de Choiseul, you see on the left here, the Duc de Choiseul, who particularly was anti-Russian in his policy. He was trying to use other countries neighboring on Russia, including the Ottoman Empire, including Sweden, and if he could, he would like to use Poland and Lithuania. He was trying to use them, in a sense, to control Russia. Russia is the big new country on the block. Russia is the one that has forced its way into the top 4 or 5 countries of Europe, and Choiseul was following a policy very much opposed to that. But the new king, Louis XVI, replaced him with the Count of Vergennes, Comte de Vergennes, who in fact had quite a bit of a different policy, a much sweeter kind of policy, much more friendly towards Russia in a variety of different ways, and of course also wanting to get back from Great Britain what had been taken from it. He was very much interested in helping the 13 colonies. So you've got this shift in French policy that comes in the 1770s. The Americans weren't sure that they wanted help from anybody. They were going to have to take it. But America, which thought of itself at that time already as being exceptional, America already thought of itself as the last best hope of mankind. It already thought of itself as the city on the hill. The Continental Congress rejected traditional European diplomacy with all of its bribery, with all of its double dealing, with all of its cynicism. You see here, in fact, a cartoon of the Eastern European monarchs dividing up Poland in the first partition of Poland. And here's the King of Poland sitting on his throne, and these three are deciding how they're going to carve it all. This is what the Americans rejected almost entirely. They didn't want to have any contacts at all. Remember, George Washington, in his farewell address, said, let's avoid any kind of entanglements with other countries. The United States wanted to avoid that. It could not avoid that in trying to get its independence. And they felt they needed somebody maybe as a counterbalance to France within Europe. If they were going to follow diplomacy, it was going to be what they called commercial diplomacy, and they also used the term militia diplomacy. In doing all of this research, I ran across this biography of William Lee, one of the several Lee brothers. Arthur Lee was also involved as a diplomat. William Lee was involved as a would-be diplomat, but it was militia diplomacy. Just as we wanted to have a militia instead of a standing army, again following perhaps English tradition in that way. We preferred to have a militia rather than a standing army. We also preferred not to have professional diplomats, a school of diplomats, but to have militia diplomats, ordinary people, an ordinary merchant who would go abroad for his country in order to strike up trade relations with other countries, all of whom are going to be more than happy to trade with the United States, they thought, in Continental Congress. It was also called commercial diplomacy because they didn't want to sign agreements, defensive alliances or offensive alliances the way European countries did, but simple commercial agreements to make it easier for our people to trade with their people. So just like we had hoped to have only a militia, it turned out we needed the French army, but we had hoped to have only a militia on the field of battle, and often did in the Revolutionary War. We also wanted to have militia diplomacy in order to carry out whatever diplomatic tasks would be necessary. So let's pick up another thread of our whole story. This is what's going on at sea. Of course, as we all know, rule of Britannia, Britannia rules the waves. This goes way back in time, and Britain did rule the waves. It's hard to pick exactly the right symbol for that because you can go from 18th century, 19th century, early 20th century and find Britannia ruling the waves. But they didn't totally rule the waves. There were privateers trying to take advantage of countries at war. This always happened when there were countries at war and goods had to be brought from one country to another. There were people who were willing to do that. Of course, the goods were going to cost a lot. And there were people who were willing to be licensed pirates at sea in order to break British control and anybody else's control if they wanted to prevent free commerce. A number of American sailors, people who had ships, were licensed. They were given letters of marque, as they were called, and they became privateers. And some of them came to Catherine the Great's attention. In 1777, there was a man named John McNeill who prayed in the Barents Sea. This is north of Norway, north of North Cape. He preyed on shipping that was going to Europe from Archangel in the north of Russia. He took a number of ships, 7 or 8 ships, scuttled some of them, others he eventually took into French ports. He was just one. Another one was John Paul Jones, who we don't think of as a pirate, but who was also one of these people who was licensed to do this kind of thing. And the British, of course, to try to stop all of this, decided that they were going to take upon themselves the right to stop any ship on the high seas, no matter what flag it was flying, and see what kind of goods it had on board. And so here we get into the law of the sea, as it was so called. There was an old concept, Consolato del mare. It's a Spanish term. And traditionally, ships were not supposed to carry any kind of military goods during wartime on the high seas. And they could freely be stopped by a country that was at war, and the goods could be taken from the ship. But the idea was growing in the 18th century that a neutral flag meant that all of the goods on board the ship, except things that were specifically prohibited in treaties that had been signed already, so a very narrow definition, that free ships ought to make free goods. And of course, it was in the interest of the neutral countries, which included the Netherlands, maybe with the biggest merchant marine of anybody, and the Swedes, who were doing a lot of trading, and the French, doing a lot of trading at sea, although, of course, the French are belligerents after 1778. But all of these countries became very much concerned about what's happening to neutral shipping. And the proposal was first made in 1779 by the Prime Minister or the Chancellor of Denmark for the neutral countries to get together. It didn't go very far. Not everybody agreed with it. It's hard to bring all of these separate countries on board. But the next year, in 1780, Catherine the Great picked up the same idea, basically It was the same plan that this man Bernstorff had. And Russia comes up with the notion, Russia, a bigger country, and people are more willing perhaps to follow it. But Catherine decided that the neutral countries should come together and form a league, that it should be a league of armed neutrals in order to prevent the boarding of their ships on the high seas, in order to protect free commerce on the high seas. And of course, it was not just against the British, it was against the American privateers, it was against the Spanish, because the Spanish at this time were boarding almost every vessel going in and out of the Mediterranean Sea. The Spanish came around, though, very quickly, and they agreed not to do this anymore. So they agreed not to violate the armed neutrality, which leaves officially only Britain as the country that's really opposed to this notion of armed neutrality. Catherine tried to get various countries to sign on to it, and a number of them did. In fact, eventually, not just North European countries, but Southern European countries, even the Ottoman Empire, eventually signed on to it. So in March of 1780, the League of Armed Neutrality. This is a Dutch cartoon that you see here. It's showing Great Britain being much maligned, getting his comeuppance, as they said in Dutch. You've got France trying to place a weird hat on his head. You've got Spain and the Netherlands trying to change his clothing. You've got Americans running away with his clothes. You've got Catherine the Great ready to beat him over the head with a club. The League of Armed Neutrality of March 1780. Well, this, of course, leads to the change in thinking in the new United States, if we can call it that yet, even though it's only recognized by France. After Saratoga, there was only military disaster for the Americans. Washington couldn't drive the British out of New York. The Americans lost Savannah, they lost Charleston. They didn't control very much that was really significant. And there was growing distrust, especially among the New Englanders of France. So they're looking for another ally on the continent. Well, who else could it possibly be? Well, the Dutch. The Dutch had fought commercial wars against the British in the past, and John Adams had been trying, he was supposedly posted to The Hague, and he was trying to get the Dutch to sign an agreement with the Americans. It took the Dutch some time to do it. Eventually they did, but they did only after Great Britain declared war on them to keep them from joining the League of Armed Neutrality. After all, if they are at war with Great Britain, they are not an armed neutral, and they couldn't really join the League. So the idea comes up, well, why not reach out to Russia? Because the thinking is, if Catherine is now opposing the British with this policy, and Britain was the main opponent of the League of Armed Neutrality, then surely she must be pro-American. And it didn't occur to people that she might want to be absolutely neutral. That is, not to help the English, whom she saw traditionally as an ally. She thought that Britain had won too much in 1763 and maybe needed to be cut back down in size a little bit. But she certainly didn't want to see Britain reduced from being one of the leading powers of Europe. Catherine, in fact, was hoping to be a mediator of peace between the colonies and Great Britain. She had offered herself already as mediatrix, using the female term, in the 18th century, and so had Joseph II of Austria-Hungary, the Habsburg ruler. He had offered himself as mediator, and the two of them were hoping maybe to win something for their countries by helping to win the peace between Great Britain and its runaway, unhappy colonies. Well, this raises the question, how could the Americans possibly think that Catherine might support them? Wasn't she a crowned head? And weren't they setting up a republic opposed to monarchy? In fact, that's our big change, to get rid of having a monarch, to get rid of a crowned head. Surely she must have seen Republican government, as seen in the United States, as a threat to crowned heads. But in fact, as Griffiths' research over many years showed, this was not at all the case. In fact, he wrote an article one time in which he demonstrated that Catherine once said, "Je suis républicaine," I am a Republican, by which she meant she had a broad spirit. But she did not at all look negatively on the Dutch Republic. In fact, she compared the 13 colonies to the Dutch getting out from under Spanish control at the end of the 1500s and the first part of the 1600s. The situation of the Dutch is that you've got people who are ruled from some other place at some distance. It's all in Europe, but Spain is some distance from the Netherlands. And she thought it was only right for the Dutch, if they were maltreated, to gain their independence from Spain. The Dutch set themselves up as a republic following Montesquieu. She thought this was perfectly the right form of government for the Dutch to have. They were a small state. They were very much a trading state, mercantile state. Republicanism suited them perfectly. But even more recently, there was the example of Corsica. The island of Corsica, which for years had been controlled by Genoa, Genoa had a lot of trouble with Corsica, and in 1768 had suddenly sold Corsica to France. And the Corsican rebellion continued. The man who had led the Corsican rebellion, Pasquale Paoli, was a hero to Catherine. She had a correspondence with him. She sent him a good deal of support. She offered to send him even more in terms of weapons, but the French put down the rebellion fairly quickly in 1768, and Paoli had to go to London, where he spent most of the rest of his life in exile. But he was a great hero. He was a hero in the 13 colonies. He was a hero to Catherine. He was a hero to the Dutch. He was a hero in Great Britain as well. In fact, there are several cities, towns in the United States named for him. The book that I just got was printed in Paoli, Pennsylvania. And there's also Paoli, Indiana, not too far south of Bloomington, Indiana. So he was a big hero. Catherine only came to see a Republican-style government as a threat in the course of the French Revolution, particularly as the French Revolution turned more and more violent. So she didn't see any kind of threat to people like her from people like George Washington and John Adams and Thomas Jefferson. Well, there was an American in Russia at this time. Stephen Sayre has a really interesting biography. Involved in politics. He wanted to be one of the colonial governors and wasn't able to get it, so he went to London. He was elected mayor of London for a year or so. He participated in the Wilkes movement, if you're familiar with British history. He was caught up in some sort of a cockamamie plot to try to overthrow George III and spent some time in the Tower of London before people helped him get out. Then he came to the Netherlands and spent some time with John Adams and decided he would go to Russia because he had heard that Catherine the Great liked handsome men. He considered himself the handsomest man in the world, and other people said he was indeed very good looking, and he said maybe she is ready for an American gallant. He wrote this in a letter to Adams, and so he showed up in Russia. But of course, the 13 colonies aren't recognized. Sayre was hoping, maybe, to gain recognition as a diplomat on behalf of the United States. But he didn't make much of a career for himself in Russia. He got involved in various kinds of commercial endeavors, went broke more than once, and ended up finally going back to France and spent a number of years after that in France. Eventually, he married into Napoleon's family, and owned a farm in southern New Jersey. He's a really interesting guy. But the Continental Congress, in deciding that it was going to choose a commercial or a militia diplomat, decided among several candidates. Among them was Arthur Adams and some others, but they decided John Jay was one that they were considering. But they decided to pick a man already in Europe. This is Francis Dana, a Massachusetts lawyer, very close to John Adams. In fact, he was Adams' secretary in The Hague, Adams being one of the 3 American commissioners who had been sent to Europe to try to improve relations with European countries. But the problem is the diplomatic language of the 18th century was French, and Dana couldn't speak any French. Congress can't afford to send a whole bunch of people, but they decided they could spring enough money for one other person, somebody who could speak a little bit of French. This was John Adams' son, J.Q. Adams, John Quincy Adams, age 14, who was learning French at the time, could speak it a little bit. And so he goes along as a secretary. And Dana is selected in late 1780, doesn't get underway because he doesn't even know he's been chosen for several months. It took a long time for the word to cross the Atlantic, but by the time he knows he's been chosen, he packs up his bags, and he and John Quincy Adams, and Dana also had a manservant with him, the three of them made the journey, which took them about 4 months, overland primarily, to get to Russia. So the United States has sent someone who is going to be a diplomatic representative, whether we call him an ambassador or not, in Russia. But the problem is he's not been invited. And his country has not been recognized when he gets to Russia. And so when he gets to Russia, he first has to learn even who the players are on the field in Russia. And at this time, there were at least these 5 who were going to be the important ones for him. First of all, of course, there's Catherine. And then secondly, there's Nikita Panin, whose idea of the northern system Russia had been following. Catherine's in the process of beginning to abandon it at this point, but she's been following Panin. People who couldn't understand Russia's foreign policy, why Russia was doing some of the things that it was doing, had pretty much convinced themselves that it was because Russia had a female ruler. A female ruler was going to be weak, never mind the fact that you had good Queen Bess back in England, but a female ruler was going to be weak. She was going to be dominated by the men in her life, lover, husband, foreign minister, someone, and that it was Nikita Panin who had been doing all of this policy, that in fact Catherine was at heart very friendly to the United States, and she would be only too willing to recognize the United States, but Panin wouldn't let it happen. Another important figure, at least as far as Dana was concerned, was Sir James Harris. He had come a couple of years earlier in 1778, professional diplomat, in fact, the first real professional diplomat, later Duke of Malmesbury, the first Duke of Malmesbury. But Sir James Harris, at every turn, he had Dana's number. Whatever Dana tried to do in St. Petersburg, Harris beat him to it. Harris knew what was going on better than Dana did, although Harris himself also believed that it was Panin who was dictating the policy, that Catherine herself would have run a different policy, but was too weak actually to do it. Gregory Potemkin is also important. He was a former lover of Catherine's and continued to be, even after they no longer shared the bed, or very rarely, he continued to be perhaps her principal advisor on all kinds of political things up until his death in 1791. And Potemkin was opposed to the colonies. He didn't really like the colonies. Not that he had that much influence on Catherine, but Dana's not going to get anywhere with Potemkin. He thought about going through Potemkin and realized soon that that wouldn't work. What Dana had been instructed to do, and he had been instructed to do this from Philadelphia, and he had also been instructed from Amsterdam by John Adams, don't do anything on your own. Don't do anything on your own. Follow the lead of the French ambassador, the Marquis de Vergennes. Only do what he thinks is permissible for you to do. Dana was one of these people who saw France as really not a full-blooded ally. France was doing things only for France's own interest. And Vergennes' policy from Paris, as it was worked out by Vergennes in St. Petersburg, he wasn't sure he wanted to go along with it. And so he's always arguing with himself. He doesn't get along very well with Vergennes. Of course, you've got this other problem. He doesn't speak French. Vergennes doesn't speak English. John Quincy Adams could make out a little bit of French. He was learning it. And Vergennes' son-in-law knew a little bit of English and had a dictionary, so they could write to each other, and then more or less they understood. But you know how in diplomacy so much is involved in nuance, connotation, and so on, and it's hard to pick all of that up. So you've got this man who comes to St. Petersburg, Francis Dana, and he sits there for a long period of time, never accepted at court, never formally introduced to Catherine, not even formally introduced to Panin or received by Panin in his office. He spends the better part of 2 years in St. Petersburg that way. Judging from his correspondence, he wasn't a great letter writer, but judging from his correspondence, he didn't have all that many contacts in St. Petersburg. He didn't see all that many people regularly, a very small handful of people, mostly merchants, no Americans in the crowd. He doesn't write at all, apparently, about observing the opening up of this huge statue dedicated to Peter the Great by Catherine, the one that was later called the Bronze Horseman. He doesn't seem to care very much about where he is in St. Petersburg as a city. He's unhappy. After a year, John Quincy Adams went home because his father thought he ought to get ready for Harvard, and there were better places to prepare himself for Harvard, and so he went back to Western Europe rather than in St. Petersburg. And so this is Dana's situation. Vergennes is calling the shots as far as Dana is concerned. Here we finally see Francis Dana. But the Comte de Vergennes in Paris is really calling all of the shots. And of course, Verac. Unfortunately, the uniform that Verac is wearing is a Napoleonic era uniform. I couldn't find any pictures of him from this earlier part of his career. He lived well into the 18th century. And in the United States, of course, the people who were giving France's point of view and pushing the Continental Congress to work more in accord with France were first the ambassador Conrad Alexandre Gérard, and then after him, Chevalier de la Lucerne. And they, of course, were sticking with Vergennes. They were doing what Vergennes wanted. Dana is frustrated at every turn. His correspondence with Adams, that's the person he corresponded with most. He's always saying, I'm just going to go ahead and open up anyway. Because he knew Adams had done that. Adams had violated what he had been told by John Jay, by Robert Livingston, by Benjamin Franklin and others. He had tried to initiate things with the Dutch, and it had worked out not badly for him. But Franklin, whom Dana didn't fully trust, is advising him not to violate what he's being told by Verac. And so Dana sits there, and he's by himself, just him and his manservant, after the first year when John Quincy Adams went home. And meantime, back in the United States, things are being settled. In the fall of October of 1781, Cornwallis was defeated, and the British then decided, the North government fell, and the British decided that the 13 colonies weren't worth sending a huge army and expending all of that effort. There were other things that were worth more elsewhere in the world. In fact, Cornwallis remade his career later on in India as one of the great governors of India under the East India Company over the last years of the 18th century. And so Dana decides he's going to come home, finally. The only person who would ever see him was the Vice-Chancellor. This was the title, Chancellor was the title of the person who generally headed foreign affairs. Catherine never allowed Panin to be Chancellor. She never let him actually have the title, but there was a Vice-Chancellor, and that was this man, Osterman. You may be able to tell from his name, he comes from Germany, originally from Western Germany. His father had come to Russia in the time of Peter the Great, and he is very important now in Russia's foreign affairs. Osterman. Osterman finally agreed to see Dana, not in his office, but at his dacha, at his place outside town, which was still a very nice palatial house. But he would see him not during business hours, but on the weekend or in the evening. They met only 2 or 3 times. Everything was off the table. Everything was unofficial. None was on the record. But Dana tried to present some of his ideas to Osterman, hoping Osterman would help him. Osterman was not really willing to extend himself beyond what the Empress herself wanted. We then have the peace treaty signed in 1783. It had been negotiated well before it was signed. This is Benjamin Rush's portrait of the American delegation. There's no British delegation because they refused to sit for it. But you see John Jay, this is going from left to right. John Jay is standing, and then John Adams is seated, and then Benjamin Franklin. And then is Lawrence, Henry Lawrence of South Carolina. And then the last guy who is sitting down looking very much as he can like George Washington is in fact Benjamin Franklin's grandson, Robert. And he's part of the party. And then of course the British didn't even allow themselves to be painted into the picture. So he comes home. By this time, the Society of the Cincinnati had already been established. And Dana was opposed to it. John Adams was opposed to it because they thought that this would create or begin perhaps to create an aristocracy in the United States. And of course, the United States didn't want an aristocracy. They were afraid of it, others were not. But the society was created in 1783. It had its own insignia. And there were two people at this period of time, or just after this, in the 1780s, at Catherine the Great's court, who had fought for a period of time in Washington's army. One was the ambassador from Sweden, Count Kurt von Steding, and the other one was the Comte de Ségur. They had both fought briefly, a year or less, but they were members of the Society of Cincinnati. Catherine did not want the insignia of a country that she did not recognize to be worn at her court, so she forbade the wearing of the insignia of the Society of the Cincinnati because it comes from a country that she did not yet recognize, she never did recognize, and finally Russia and the United States recognized each other in the presidency of Thomas Jefferson and the reign of Alexander I of Russia. So I may have run a little bit longer than I intended, but I think we still have time for questions. Again, I've posted here the email or address, the web address that you can contact at Slavica and tell them that you were here. Catherine, the two means that you were here. Nobody else has this address and nobody else can get into Slavica this way except us. Or if that for some reason doesn't work for you or you decide not to do it that way, you can call them probably tomorrow or after that, a little late in the day today, at this toll-free number. And all of us who are here today, we get 30% off the full price of the book. To remind you, it's a very thick book. It's got 650 pages of text, plus the index and the bibliography. And it will ship free for you as well. So thank you very much. Carolyn, back to you.
Thank you so much, George, for that fascinating talk. And I have several questions that I'm going to get started with here, but I just wanted to remind everybody that if you'd like to ask Dr. Munro a question, please either click on the Q&A button down on the bottom bar and type in your question there, or you can type in to the chat button a question. But okay, so I'm going to get started with a few of these questions. First of all, why did it take Catherine so long to recognize the United States? I mean, the Jefferson administration was, you know, more than a decade later. What was the problem in the delay there in recognition?
It's a good question. It's a very good question. And the book deals with that very question. She didn't see any reason to. She didn't see any benefit from it. In those days, countries didn't recognize every other country. You recognized the ones that were important to you, and you sent diplomatic personnel to the ones that were important to you. But the only real contact that there could be between the fledgling United States and Russia would be in trade. But the problem was, except for indigo and rice, we traded in virtually the same products. So we're not going to be buying and selling from each other. We're going to be dealing with other countries. And Russia didn't need the United States. And so it never even entered her mind, in fact, that it might be necessary to do that. This is a country that would be good for us to recognize. No, this is a country nobody knows whether it's going to amount to anything or not. It may soon be conquered by some other European country. Who's to know what's going to happen 100 years later or 200 years later? But that seems to be the principal reason. It was simply that the United States was not significant enough. Russia had a lot of other countries that were much closer, for the same reason that there were countries in Asia that were not recognized by Russia. They didn't really have diplomatic relations with China. They pretty much studiously ignored each other, the Russians and the Chinese, after 1727. That's the real reason. There was no reason for the two of them to come together. There were very few American ships traded in Russia under American flags. Even in the 1780s and 1790s, there were no more than a handful. You could count them on the fingers of both hands in almost any year, usually on the fingers of one hand, ships that were flagged to the United States that went to St. Petersburg to trade or to some other Russian port to trade.
Oh, that's fascinating. So my second question here, the first question was really sort of about the end of the story, but the second question is more about the beginning of the story. And that has to do with why Catherine refused to support the British with troops early on. What would have been in her interest to deny that request from the British?
Okay, you're talking about losing control of your own troops by renting them out to somebody. Who rents out their troops? Who rents out their army? Well, as we know, Hesse, right? How big is Hesse? Well, Hesse's not very big. Mecklenburg, how big is Mecklenburg? Well, Mecklenburg's not very big. So a first-rate country doesn't do that. You don't rent your army out to somebody else. And that seems to be a large part of what persuaded her. And then the second thing was she really thought that the British had gotten too big for their britches during this period of time. And she thought that it would be good if Britain had something of a comeuppance. And maybe these 13 colonies on their own or with somebody else's help could give Britain something of a comeuppance. To cut them back a little bit in size, not back to being a small power, but so that they weren't as significant as they were. So those were principal reasons why she, in the end, said, no, the British really want it. They really want to make a deal here, but we're not going to do it.
I have a question here from a familiar name to both of us, David Hayter. So David would like to know, he says, I'm interested in the parallel between Catherine and American founding theoreticians like Jefferson, especially considering the importance of Voltaire and Diderot to both. Is it possible that she was closer ideologically to our founders than might be previously expected? That is, you mentioned her saying, je suis républicaine, for example.
Well, how could a crowned head possibly feel herself all that close to people who are getting rid of crowned heads? What she meant was her attitude towards life, her attitude towards doing things was what she thought of, the way she understood the word Republican in those days. That's what it meant to her. Griffiths, throughout this book, spends a great deal of attention looking at what people thought, because he said for them that was what was important. And what were the ideas that they had then? What was their way of understanding the world? And I think that's really important to do, to go back and look at all of that. Catherine was a close follower of Montesquieu. She borrowed heavily, today we would say plagiarized, from Montesquieu herself. But she thought that different forms, different peoples, depending on their history, their geographic location, what people did there for a living, depending on a number of things, they needed to have different forms of government. She thought republics were very good forms of government for mercantile nations, for trading nations that didn't particularly aspire to have important roles politically in the world. And so Venice is a republic. the United Provinces of the Netherlands are a republic, and this is how she viewed the United States. That's an appropriate form of government for them. An appropriate form of government for Russia is monarchy. Although many Europeans were arguing, particularly Jean-Jacques Rousseau, that Russia is not a monarchy, Russia is a despotism. But Catherine said, no, we are a European country, we are a monarchy. And this was appropriate for most European countries. Despotism was appropriate for countries in the East, as they spoke of it, whatever you mean by that. Democracy was not considered seriously really by anybody at that period of time. Democracy ruled by the demos was seen really as being unworkable. You could make it work for a little while, but it eventually ate itself up, was the attitude in the 18th century. And so Catherine, she probably would have thought that for those 13 colonies sitting on the Atlantic seaboard east of the Appalachian Mountains, the Republican form of government is right for them. What they are doing is the right thing. But let's not try to apply it to everybody in the world. Thank you, David, for that question.
So I have a perfect follow-up question here from Raymond Wee. That is, he wants to know, did Catherine change her position on Republican governments during the French Revolution?
You know, Catherine had a hard time figuring out what was going on in France because something very similar to that was going on at the same time in the Austrian Netherlands. And it was put down in the Austrian Netherlands, particularly in Brabant, without a great deal of difficulty. So who knew what this was going to turn into? And for the first year or so, Catherine persuaded herself that France had too many lawyers. Any country that has too many lawyers, they are going to be unhappy. They're always going to want to have more power than they have or than they really ought to have, was what she thought. And so she tended to blame it on the lawyers because that's a lot of the people that you had involved in 1789 were lawyers, people who were versed and practiced the law. Just as the same thing was true in the 13 colonies. No, she did turn against the French Revolution. She gave support to a lot of the people who had fled France, including the younger brothers of Louis XVI. His younger brothers came and lived for a while in St. Petersburg, and a number of other people from the French nobility who came, and she gave them succor in Russia for a period of time. So she turned against the French Revolution, but she did not get involved in it. She did not join the coalitions against France. The Prussians and the Austrians even got together on this one. And if the Prussians and the Austrians get together on something, it must be bad. But they wanted Catherine to participate in it. She did not. It was only under her son Paul that Russia, for the first time, began to get involved in some of the wars of the French Revolutionary era. But she definitely thought that the terror had gone one too far, definitely, and well before that.
Our colleague Emily Raymond wants to know a little bit about the work that you did on this manuscript. That is, she asks, what were some of the challenges finishing this book after the passing of David Griffiths?
That's a very good question. And someone who has had experience doing this kind of thing herself or himself could probably share the similar sort of thing. First of all, his son wasn't sure he could even open his dad's computer. And when he finally did, he said, there's 16 chapters here and an introduction. And so I said, well, send it to me and see what we've got. Because David had told me that he had over 1,700 pages. Well, he had 1,700 pages plus in courier type. And so when I changed the typeface, I immediately reduced it down to about 1,100 pages. And then I set to work cutting parts of it, chapter by chapter, cutting things that I thought were really interesting, but not necessarily central to this topic. Some people may think I still left too much in. I don't think so, but cut it down by quite a bit. I also cut down his footnotes. He was a prolific researcher. He did research in archives in 8 different countries to write this book, including Russia, the United States, Great Britain, the Netherlands, Germany, or Prussia it was then, Austria. What should I leave out? He researched in all of those places, and everything that he found either in print or in an archive in his footnotes, he gave both as sources, the archival source, and if it was printed in whole or in part somewhere, he also put that in the footnote. Well, I took those out because the footnotes are overbalancing the book. And so what I left in was only, if he cited both references, I left only the archival reference so that people can go back to the original. For these days, because so much archival stuff is now even online, you might even find a good bit of it online. In fact, I did some when I was checking out footnotes. I found some of the sources now online.
Well, I'm going to ask one final question before we allow you to take a breath, Dr. Munro. And it's a little bit of a two-part question, partly from one of our students, Audrey Spann. So Audrey asks, when Dana returned home, what was the perception of his attempts to be a diplomatic representative in Russia? Did his lack of success reflect at all negatively on him? And I wonder if you could just go a little bit beyond that, then to tell us, what do you think the big takeaway of this sort of lack of collusion, but also a little bit of a moment lost in translation can tell us about both American and Russian history?
Okay, very good two-part question. First thing, Dana rarely talked about his experience in Russia after he came home. He had brought a few things home with him, including a great big bear fur coat, and he would sometimes show off his coat in cold weather in Massachusetts, but he hardly ever said anything about it. And he turned very much against countries outside the United States. He became Chief Justice of the Massachusetts Supreme Court of the Commonwealth of Massachusetts, and he became a strong supporter of the Alien and Sedition Acts under John Adams, because of course he was a good friend of John Adams, so you might expect he would support Adams' policy in all of that. So the rest of his life, even though he had an important public life after that, his experience in Russia hardly figured into it. It's almost as though it was a nightmare he wanted to forget. Because, well, as you can imagine, he had hardly anyone really to talk to. He spent about 2 years when he could have been doing other kinds of things. And after this teenager left and went home, he's the only one there who's an American. I think his manservant was a Dutchman. And so it was not too happy. In terms of what it says in the bigger story, no collusion, no understanding of each other from the very beginning, very little foreknowledge of each other. The Americans, when they sent Dana, sent him without his having been invited, without their country having been recognized. They sent him on a kind of a hunch that maybe things would work out. Maybe they were that desperate at that point. But I think that's one of the most important things it says. It also says that we are, all of us, prisoners of what we think we know. And you may think you understand something. Dana thought that he understood, and James Harris the same way, his big British opponent. They both thought they understood that Catherine, in fact, would have followed a different policy from the one Russia was following. They didn't really know that Panin was doing what Catherine wanted done, that Catherine was going to observe absolute neutrality in all of this. She said to a number of people that she would not recognize the United States until Great Britain had done so. And after the preliminary treaty had been agreed to, Dana, this is when he particularly tried to make his play through Osterman. He tried to make a big argument through Osterman. But still, no, unless it's finally done. And then she even said it another way to somebody else. Until George III receives some sort of diplomatic person from the United States, I will not do so. I will continue to be absolutely neutral because these were their colonies and they may be independent, but that's still a matter between Great Britain and the former colonies. Until they have completely settled it themselves, I'm not going to involve myself. So I think lack of understanding is a very important thing. In the 13 colonies, almost nothing was known about Russia. It's really humorous to read the chapter in the book about that, what Americans knew about Russia, because we knew almost nothing. And the Russians knew precious little more about the colonies. They maybe were a little bit better informed. In fact, Catherine, she knew enough about the colonies to want to include the Iroquois language in a dictionary of many different languages. She wanted to put together a dictionary of 11 or 12 different languages. What does this word mean in all of those different tongues? And she asked to have several words translated into French from Iroquois so that she could include a North American language in her dictionary. So she knew a little bit more maybe about North America, but again, probably not a great deal more. We are all prisoners of what we maybe think we know, or of what some country was at one time, and we perhaps understood it then, but countries change, and maybe that country isn't any longer what it was at one time. That often works around the world. So I think that's maybe the great lesson to be drawn from this really lack of understanding.
It's a good reminder that even now, you know, our cultural understandings of other countries often feels like trying to nail jelly to the wall. And it's good to know that that is not a new process.
Well, which is important. And of course, the American tendency to appoint people as ambassadors who are not career diplomatic officials. You know, militia diplomacy, in a sense, still continues in the United States. Who gets the really plum positions? It's big donors to the guy who happens to be president at the time. They get the really plum positions around the world. It's not the career diplomats who have spent years and years and years in these little bitty countries that don't matter, trying to work up to some big country, and they never quite get there. So some things still remain the same from what they were back at the very beginning.
It's a slightly terrifying idea, but there we are. So I know that a few people still have questions for you. So I'm just going to remind everyone that if you'd like to ask Dr. Munro more questions, please email him at gmunro@vcu.edu. That's gmunro, all one word, @vcu.edu. And with that, George, thank you so much. This was just a great pleasure. We learned so much. Thank you.
Munro is spelled the way it is on the screen. Don't spell it the Virginia way. Spell it the Scotland way.
So thank you. Yes, Munro. So thank you so much. And thank you all for attending. I really am very grateful to have so many people attending this terrific talk. And with that, thank you so much, George, and we'll see you soon.
Okay, thanks a lot. Good luck, everybody. Hang in there. Don't forget to vote a week from today.